Like I mentioned today, we celebrate the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. Paul, of course, being our patron saint here, so it's a day of added solemnity for us, so that's kind of nice. But both of these apostles, they died, they were martyred in Rome, so that's why we wear red today. Peter famously was crucified upside down at the Roman Circus, which was back in the day in Rome, it was on the Vatican Hill. So later on, when we built the Vatican, we named the Vatican after the hill that it's built on. St. Peter's Basilica, now built on the site of Peter's crucifixion and death. St. Paul, since he was a Roman citizen, he got a more dignified death. He was beheaded outside of the Roman wall. So even to this day, you can go to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the wall, it's called. So you can go to the places of both of their martyrdoms, both of them where they've been buried. And since the ancient of days, we've celebrated their feast on this the same day. So much that we could talk about with these two, but I just want to focus our attention on one simple thing, the most important thing, but the one simple thing that we can point to for both. And that's that both of their lives were marked and shaped and determined and dominated by one simple fact. We heard it in the gospel today. They believe, they profess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, when we hear that, because we live in America, we hear that and we're just like, oh, yeah, so they're on the Jesus team, great. Some other people, they're on Muslim team. Some other people, they're on Buddha team. Other people are on the Hindu team. Some people are on no team. But that's great. Yeah, believe in Jesus. That's great. Have a good life, guys. And that's it. We just kind of like, oh, cool, whatever. That's where you go to church on Sunday. Have a nice time. But it was so much more than just where they went to church on Sunday or something. For Peter and Paul, when they professed Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that radically meant that everything in their life was going to change. And then they refused to give up on this fact, even when they started to be ostracized by their family, their friends, their communities, even when they began to be persecuted. Again, we heard about them being thrown in prison today, even when it led up to their death, their martyrdom. They refused to give up on this fact which dominated their life. Simon Peter, again, we know his story. He was a pretty lucrative fisherman up there in Galilee. And yet when he encounters Jesus Christ, he doesn't just say, okay, well, I guess I'll believe in you kind of a little bit, some. No, he says, I'll ditch my job and I'll follow after you. Even when I get thrown in prison, even when I get put to death. Paul, our patron, Paul was an up-and-coming Pharisee. He was destined to be one of the leaders of the Jewish people. There's like they didn't have senators in Israel at the time, but Paul would have been like that sort of level of important in the Jewish people, among the Jewish people. He initially was a persecutor of the Christians, and yet what happens? When he encounters Christ on the road to Damascus, all of a sudden things change. He professes Jesus is the Christ, ditches his job, and begins to follow after the Lord. When you make this profession that Jesus is the Christ, it's more than just, oh, that's where I go to church on Sunday. For them, at least, it meant this is now the sole and most important determining factor in my life. If Jesus is Lord, for example, back in their day, if you're saying Jesus is Lord, you're also saying Caesar is not. An easy thing in our day would be like, if Jesus is Lord, then work is not, sports are not, Netflix is not, all these things are not. That's the kind of thing that they're saying. So one of my greatest hits, again, which is a relative term, I know that, it's very relative, but I hope that one of my greatest hits has been holding up this kind of faith and this standard of what faith is. Faith is not just, well, I believe in God. That's called theism. It's very different. But faith, to say I've placed my faith in God, I've placed my faith in Jesus Christ, it's to say that everything in my life now revolves around that. What the narrative, the story, everything, what gives meaning to my life is that Jesus Christ is Lord. So the simple question that I just want us to reflect on today is just this. Am I willing then to follow that same path as Saints Peter and Paul? A path that doesn't always lead to comfort. One that sometimes is going to lead to ostracization by others. A path that isn't always going to make us the most popular. But am I willing to follow after Jesus Christ through those ups and downs? Knowing that it's Christ himself that I have to follow because he's the one that responds to everything that I need. I've given a lot of examples of this over the years, and the great saints and martyrs are always the easiest ones to point to. So for example, I've talked about St. Jose Sanchez del Rio. Okay, he was that 14-year-old boy down in Mexico during the Cristero War. So this is less than 100 years ago. This is 1928 down in Mexico. 14 years old, and he's put to death because he refuses to say that Jesus is not the king. He dies shouting, "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King. The soldiers shoot him, bury him where he stood. I've talked about blessed Franz Jägerstätter. Right? Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian farmer back in the 1940s. Just a farmer. We all know some farmers, right? Okay, just a normal dude. Here Franz is, but he was in Austria in the 1940s, so he's drafted into the Third Reich. He's drafted into the Nazi army. But he refuses to fight. Why? One, because he knows what's really going on, but two, because that's incongruent with his faith. Because he says Jesus is the Lord, he says, I cannot go along with that. And even when they say, just sign this piece of paper that say you go along with us, but you don't even have to mean it, and then we'll let you go. You can go back to your home. He refuses to sign even that, and he's put to death for his faith. Now, as beautiful and as powerful as all these stories, and I can tell so many stories, about as beautiful as these examples are of this great faith, what's our reaction to those? Our reaction is typically, wow, that was great. Man, so inspiring. But I live in Kansas in 2025, and I don't need to worry about that. Which is true. We live in Kansas in 2025. Unless something really bad happens within very soon, like we probably don't need to worry about anything like that for 100, 150 years. It's Kansas. So when we hear those sorts of examples, when we hear about this level of faith, this standard of faith, it's easy for us to kind of go, yeah, but I go to church, Father, don't worry about it. I'm fine. We're all okay. And yet, as I've pointed out many times, we are still facing great persecution for our faith. It just looks very different. And yet, it's more potent. If we're talking about my greatest hits, there's the one story I've told way too much, but I'm going to tell it one more time, that I've used to illustrate this, and that's that story of the man from China. Right? Remember, back in the 1950s in China, it became illegal to be a Catholic. The church was forced underground. The Chinese set up their own Catholic church. You can't do that. But they're like, just go to our Catholic church now. And they're like, no. So the Catholic church moves underground, and all of a sudden they start having masses in their homes, just clandestine masses, sneaking the priest around to the different towns and villages and cities. Well, mass was held one day at a certain man's house, and during mass, the person runs in and says the authorities are on their way, so everybody scatters, priests scatter, but this man, the owner of the home, is arrested. And for weeks, he is beaten and burned and cattle prodded and all you can imagine, tortured, with a simple question that I keep asking him, just tell us who this priest is. We don't want you, man. Tell us who the priest is, tell us where we can find him, and we'll let you go. But this man has such a devotion to his faith, such a devotion to the Eucharist, so much does he not want to deprive others of this, because who knows when they'll find a priest again. He refuses to give this priest up. He's resolved, he's willing, he's ready to go to his death for his faith. But the Chinese get kind of bored of him, and they're just like, never mind, and they let him go. So a couple of years later, him and his family are able to escape from communist China. They come to the United States, and they settle up in the northeast part of the country, up near Boston. When his family get there, they're just overjoyed, because it's Boston. And this would be like back during the 80s and 90s. So 80s and 90s Boston, it's like Catholic Central. There's a church on every single corner. And so they're just ecstatic. They're like, wow, this is great. They have a church right down their street. They can go to daily mass. Life is beautiful. This guy gets himself a job, starts working up, saving up some money, and eventually he opens up his own Chinese restaurant, starts to live the American dream. He's very good at this. He opens up another restaurant and eventually opens up a third restaurant there in the Boston area. Buys his family a new house, gets him a new car, sends his kids, it's Boston, I don't know if you know anything about Boston, there's some pretty preppy schools over there. He sends his kids to the most prestigious private schools you can send your kids to in Boston. He's living it. But in the midst of this, if you know anybody, does anybody know anybody that owns a restaurant? Works in a restaurant? Restaurants are not really a 9-to-5 job if you're the owner. If you're owning and operating 3 different restaurants, that's called a 24/7 job. And eventually, soon, this guy starts not going to mass with his family every day. Soon he's not even going to mass on Sundays with his family. Goes on Christmas and Easter, maybe a person's wedding. And eventually, recently, he no longer even goes to mass. This is why I bring this up. Again, here's this man. In one part of his life, he's literally tortured for his faith. Literally thrown in prison for his faith. but upholds his faith and the Eucharist, all of it. But again, in that part of his life, we would compare him to people like Saints Peter and Paul, Jose Sanchez del Rio, Blessed Franz Jägerstätter. That's where he was at. But then he comes to our country, land of the free, home of the Chiefs. Comes to our country, and what happens? All of a sudden, he doesn't even go to Mass. I know I've told this story too many times, and I'm going to tell it to everyone that I go see later on in life. But this is why I continue to tell it. Because it's very easy for us to not see things clearly. Again, what communist China could not do, what torture could not do, what a cattle prod couldn't do, our fate, our culture, our country was able to do, the American dream was able to do, without trying. We're all here today because we're all on the Jesus team, right? Somewhat, thanks. We're all on the Jesus team, more or less. Some degrees, different varying degrees. We're all on Jesus' side. Good, great. We profess, like Peter and Paul, Jesus is the Christ, Jesus is the Lord. Good job. We're all crushing it there. But then, if that is what we profess, we should then also expect, like Peter and Paul, to face persecution. But what's happened here is we've started to say, but this is America, this is Kansas. Maybe out on the East Coast in New York there's some persecution, but this is Kansas, we're fine. We're fine. But do we face a persecution? Yes. And I would argue that it's more potent than the persecution that they face in communist China. What's the persecution we face? What does it look like? It's the number one persecutor of religion in America. Work, your job. That's the number one thing, is all of a sudden work becomes more important than our faith. What's the second biggest persecutor of the faith? Sports, good job. Sports are the second biggest persecutor of the faith. We all believe if Pat Mahomes just wins 3 in a row, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be in heaven. That'll be it. Or think what happens when school starts, or even during the summer, your coach hands you your schedule, right? Here's practices, here's the games. All of a sudden, this sheet of paper with all the practices and games on it literally becomes more important than God. That becomes the center of my life. My life revolves around whatever this piece of paper tells me. Again, we don't look at it that way. It's just sports. Just have some fun, Father. Come on. But no, that's what happens. What's the third biggest persecutor of the faith? Just busyness. I was talking to somebody yesterday. They hadn't been to church in a while, but I said, hey, how's it going? Just like that. I didn't be like, hey, how's it going? No, I was like, hey, how's it going? And they go, Father, just been so busy. I know I haven't been in church. I've just been so busy. And I was like, I didn't ask, but okay, thanks. Thanks for telling me. This is, again, when it comes to those things, is work a sin? No. Or sports a sin? No. Is being busy a sin? No. So we think, well, I'm not sinning, so it's all good. But those are the subtle little ways that the enemy himself is now using to pull us away from our faith. I would argue it'd be easier for us if we were in communist China being persecuted literally and with torture for our faith. But no, here we are in the United States where it can actually be even more difficult to hold on to our faith. We have to recognize that, though. Right? We have to recognize that here in the 21st century in America, that's what it looks like. We don't have soldiers. We have a desire for money, for a different house, a new life, whatever that is. We have neighbors. We have teammates. We have coaches. We don't face prison. We face isolation. We face FOMO. Do we know what FOMO is? Kids, tell your parents what FOMO is. Fear of missing out. We fear missing out on things, so we go along with all those things. And in the midst of it, what happens? Many people begin to abandon their faith, just like this man from China. Paul, he was talking about it in our second reading. This is not new. Don't feel like, this is America's problem. This has been there since the beginning. Right after our second reading, Paul says, Demas, enamored of the present world, abandoned me. Not Demas was being persecuted and tortured, and Demas couldn't handle it anymore and got out of there. Demas, enamored of the present world. I think I've told you this before. Our seminary professors would tell us, don't be a Demas. Kids, tell your parents what that means too. Okay, never mind. Don't be a Demas. Don't allow yourself to be enamored of the present world and allow that to pull you away from the faith. So the question is simply that, are we allowing ourselves to subtly and without even knowing it, be persecuted for our faith? Or are we seeking consciously that greatness that is the kingdom of heaven? My hope is that today on the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, we become and receive a grace to become more willing, a strength to continue to follow after and follow this path, which we know it doesn't always lead to praise and comfort and all those sorts of things. It often has great challenges. And yet, as Paul says, it is the path that leads to that crown of righteousness. It is the path, the only path, that leads us safely to the kingdom of heaven.